The Skies Are Mine by Jay Wilburn. Since the dragon attacks had begun again, commerce, especially in the air, but also by land and sea, had been crippled. Not only the knights in their now only the knights in their airships dared to enter the skies above the terrified land. They guarded the borders, but trying to repel attacks from all directions had spread the royal fleet thin. To the northwest, above the highest peaks of the Grey Mountains, only the trio of Law, Baz, and Roe patrolled these treacherous winds. The hope was that they could handle it, that no dragon would risk those deadly downdrafts themselves, or that if they did, their three. Okay, here we go. If they did, 3 of their best knights could repel it. All right, already found something I had to fix. That's not a good sign. As Sir Lawrence Sixsmith on the deck of the Tarpon, below 6 windbags, saw the creature undulating through the violent winds over the peaks toward them, he certainly had his doubts. He flipped the control levers and opened the valves, allowing the boiler to heat for the battle and the maneuvers to come. He leaned toward the mouthpiece of the amplifier horn. Before he could say anything, Sir Rowena Moody, from the wheel of her ship Charity Arrow, projected her voice to him. "We see it, Law. I'm going high like we planned." Even as she spoke, the nose of her ship turned skyward, and she started to climb through the thin air. To Law's other side, Sir Basil Dolphin took the javelin with its oddly festive circus tent stripes over the balloons into a controlled dive. Baz must not have realized his lips were close enough to the mouthpiece to pitch his voice to the other ships. He cursed the wild winds trying to pull him off course, and he mumbled brimstone. Law wrinkled his brow. He thought he must have misheard Baz's rantings, but he aimed the spyglass across the mountains anyway. Black and gray scales fell in and out of focus as the beast closed the distance quickly. Finally, Law caught the dragon in frame, and as it soared upward again on its course, its belly was a little lighter than the rest of its scales and its massive leathery wings, but only by degrees. It was all severe angles and sharp claws and horns. Extra spikes along its side and back made it look like the monster was covered in dark thorns. Law caught sight of the dragon's eyes for the briefest moment. Pale white, flecked with gray, and a rare jagged slash of reptilian black for its eye. That thin, centered darkness staring back at Law looked like a lightning bolt in negative. He hadn't misheard Baz at all. He wished to the heavens he had. This was Navroi, the Navroi. This ancient beast had been called Brimstone as far back as Law tracked his ancestors and beyond. If it was coming for the kingdom over these treacherous mountains against all the instincts of its species, then this creature was wise and devious. It flew right toward the 3 of them because it knew they were in as much danger as it was, and it knew they stood at the least chance of repelling him. Law set aside the spyglass and armed the weapons for the fight of his life. If he died today, no doubt he would be a legend, but that seemed small consolation, a poor second prize indeed. Excuse me. The final few lunges of the monster through the air seemed to close the distance in a fraction of the time it took to cross the rest of the range. The air wavered in front of Brimstone's open jaws. It made him appear to be surfacing from below rough waters. Law knew what it meant and deployed the forward shield instead of opening up with his own attack. Flame, like burning liquid, ignited from pouches and ducts within the reptile's cheeks. As the flame met the outside air, it spread and brightened, spilling over the double rows of sharp teeth in the dragon's wide maw. Fire washed out the world around Law and his ship. He felt as though he had locked himself within a furnace. That wasn't far from the truth. The thick fabric of the deployed shield held briefly, but then ignited and split open in several places. The dragon roared, and the fire cut off abruptly just as the shield twirled away in burning ribbons under his keel. The heat had lifted his ship sharply, and the new wave of cold dropped him again. The dragon had veered under him, and now he risked crashing into its thorny back, racing by below. Law whirled control wheels and stressed the bell of his boilers in order to steer himself away from the immediate danger. The flap of Brimstone's starboard wing shook the hull like a quake. Law held on as the deck tilted nearly sideways in his evasive maneuver. The dragon's tail, more deadly than any flail ever forged by men, swung toward him. Law released air from the bags and spiked into a downdraft on purpose. The sharp points from two of the monster's tail spikes raked Harpoon's hull and tore away heat-resistant tiles. It was better than shattering upon them. As Law spun down in a death spiral, like being trapped in a violent whirlpool, he calmly refilled the bags and turned the wheels slowly. Trying to come out of the dive too abrupt would split his ship apart. Turning at the wrong angle would slam him into the sheer mountainside. He eased himself around as turbulence shook the world into a meaningless blur. If the dragon decided to press the attack on him, he would be dead before he saw Brimstone coming. The vibrations of rough winds remained, but he could see again as he leveled out far below the dragon's wake. He was lower than Baz's ship, looking up at its ruddy belly and funny stripes. That meant he was way out of formation. The dragon circled on Ro as the beast now had her and Charity Arrow isolated. Either the dragon was wiser in strategy than the three of them combined, or they were just fools for fighting a monster like this under these conditions. Ro lit up the beast's side with a barrage of explosive harpoons. They burst bright off the creature's hard scales. She might as well have been firing on the mountain itself for all the good it would do. But then the last several projectiles all hit the connection of the dragon's wing on that side. The beast roared again like before. It veered hard away from the attack and downward as it folded its abused wing into its side. That's exactly what the monster did when it stopped its fire attack on Law's ship. That was no accident. Ro had attacked it first and saved Law by a hair's breadth. He noted that he owed her a drink if they survived this. The dragon twisted in the air and flapped both wings out from its body, very hard to stabilize itself again. The creature found itself positioned between the three ships in a crossfire, with Law being the low ship this time. Brimstone might be wiser than Law, but it appeared Ro had them all beat in cleverness. Baz took up the fight and struck at the other wing with chain ties. The heavy weight spun through the air as the chains wrapped the leathery wing like something thin and weak. The dragon roared in what had to be rage and frustration. It spit a thin cord of fire out into the windy sky. The fire twisted in all sorts of interesting shapes. The creature folded its wings and dropped again, escaping the ties in the process. Now it was level with Law, below the new crossfire point. It turned its dark lightning eyes on Law, and the air wavered and distorted in front of its ugly face. Law finally joined the fight and unloaded his forward weapons into its mouth. The great lizard choked and twisted away. Law had missed its mouth more than he hit, but may have scratched its eye. More of the arsenal from the higher two ships fell on the dragon's back. It whipped its head from side to side and flapped hard to drive itself straight upward. If it had a strategy at that point, the ancient dragon was simply trying to clear itself of all the irritation. The chemicals it left unignited in the air behind smelled like the acidic mix the squires used for cleaning iron. Brimstone spun upward and soared between the other two ships. It turned in the air and sprayed a wide breath of fire down on Ro and Baz. Law cursed and powered up his boilers to get himself up where the battle was. Ro and Baz scrambled. Two of her balloons burst and then disintegrated. Baz had a number of blackened ropes snap, and he struggled to get the ship stabilized as it spun downward through the air. Law soared up between them both. He glanced both ways. Ro swung from a rope from one side of her ship to the other as she repositioned her surviving airbags. She had a broad, toothy smile across her face. Law wanted to read it as fear, but it sure looked like she was having fun. Baz was a different story. His ship threatened to roll over from the missing ropes. If it did, it would dump him out to the ground. As he struggled to save his ship and himself, his clothing was scorched, hair singed, and his skin blistered from fresh burns. Law raced upward, past and away from them to face the dragon alone, to give them time to regroup. The beast tried to wash Law in fire as well, but he flew right at its belly. The fire missed him, and he exploded a few loaded harpoons against those lighter scales. The dragon tried to flap backward, but Law matched the beast and stayed nosed up to its underside. The dragon roared and tried to claw the ship away. This was the risk of this foolhardy play. Law aimed up and peppered the underside of the dragon's jaw with artillery. The beast hissed and snapped. Its claws missed him, and it flapped backward again, so Law stayed with it. The monster growled out a series of complex noises that sounded for all the world like language. All men who knew the languages of dragons were long dead, though. Law had no eyes on his friends, but he knew time was what they needed, and as much as he could buy them. He caught sight of something else dark and closing behind him. He thought it was either Ro or Baz returning to help, but the shape was too big. He turned his attention back into the fight and harassed the lizard some more to keep its claws off him a little while longer. Ro's voice carried from below. She amplified something to him. He hoped her ship and what remained of her arsenal would be close behind. "Behind you," she cried. He looked for her, but she wasn't there. It was a warning, then, about the dark shape. All he could think was a second dragon. They could barely hold their own with the first one. As Brimstone twisted away and dove downward a little to get away from Law, the knight took the chance to swing his ship out and wide to keep the second beast from burning him up from behind. What he saw as he brought the harpoon around scared him more than a pair of dragons would have. He recognized it right away, but had to get over a few seconds' denial in order to process it. It was the Dreadmore, Lord Shrine's flying fortress. As Brimstone flew out over the mountains again, Law said, "Good, very good. Turn your wrath on that villain a little while." But then Brimstone swung wide behind the flying fortress, and Shrine's crew fired a volley of shots in the direction of the trio of knights and the kingdom. Law's jaw unhinged in shock. The ships were far out of range, and the barrage fell harmless through the mountain passes below. Still, it gave the dragon a moment to recover. Brimstone or Lord Shrine alone were formidable enemies, but together, if they were in fact working together, they were worse than any nightmare Law had ever experienced in his natural life. He made what he could of the lull as well. He reloaded and used the spyglass to try to locate his compatriots. Baz was flying very low. The belly of his ship must have been brushing the treetops down there. It looked as if the knight and his trusty airship had both suffered terrible blows. Law could not locate Ro or the Charity Arrow at all. Law cranked up the boilers until steam leaked loud, hot, and shrill from the seams. This was no way to treat a ship that you planned to fly for years, but it might be a thing you would do if you only planned to live one more day. He unleashed all that power and skipped across the tops of wind currents at surprising speed. By the time Shrine and his crew got a few shots off, Law was bobbing up and down on the uneven wings, too jagged of a pattern for them to aim and hit. The Dreadmore turned hard over the mountains to try to avoid Law's reckless headlong strike. A ship the size of Shrine's was stable and hard to take down, but it was slow to move. As it turned, Law caught sight of the great dragon perched on the back of the Dreadmore where it rested. There was no doubt now. Brimstone and Lord Shrine had formed a dark alliance. Law himself was going to be one of the first victims of that unholy partnership. When they spoke of his sacrifice, it would be his failure, not his bravery, that would be remembered in the dark days to come, he now knew. The dragon growled in that garble of syllables again. Its horrid voice echoed through the mountains below. In that warbling roar, Law realized he could understand the words of a human tongue. It wasn't his native language, but it was one he knew well enough. The dragon's words sounded like wind through a haunted cave that had learned to speak. I am the Navro, and the skies are mine." Law had a new worst nightmare now. As Brimstone launched from the deck of the Dreadmore and puffed out its cheeks to ignite a new and final fire for Law, Charity arrows soared up from below the enemy. Ro turned her vessel hard as if going into a new dive. Before the dragon completed its first lap, Ro unloaded every armament she had left into its exposed wing. The dragon roared and closed its eyes tight as it twisted to the side away from the pain. In its blind fall, it crashed into the Dreadmore and ruptured its hull. Crewmen fell screaming toward the mountains below. The ship wobbled through the rest of its turn, and it flew away from the kingdom as it vented steam and lost altitude a bit at a time. Law felt a dark hope that Lord Shrine would not make it home. The Dreadmore was tough, though, and was hard to bring down, even damaged. The great dragon dove. Law expected it to rip through Roe's ship, but the beast dove past as if she were of no concern. Roe started her climb through the troublesome winds. The monster snatched the falling, screaming crewmen in its claws one by one. It did not get them all as the last few fell to their deaths. The dragon flapped hard upward, and Law was sure Brimstone intended to eat the men it had caught right up until the moment it set them gently upon the surviving section of the Dreadmoor's deck. Law stared in shock. The beast really was for the kingdom's enemy. It had invested itself in saving as many of its allies as it could. Law burned with anger and jealousy that the dragon would save those men, even as it tried to bring down Law and his fellow knights. This was truly a war then. Sides had been drawn, and the other side had a dragon. Brimstone rolled over, away from the sky fortress, and turned its snout northward. In its retreat, however, its spiked tail tore off the port side of Roe's rising ship. She fell back into a dive, and now she careened for the ground out of control. Law emptied his airbags and dove steeper than her. As Roe clung to her deck, braced herself for impact, the tarpon, piloted by Law, hit the damaged side of her ship first. Deck boards peeled away into the rushing wind. She met eyes with him as they dove together. He waved her over like she was late for an appointment. Raw charged across the splintering deck. The vessels already started to pull away from each other as Law refilled his airbags. She leapt the final distance, seeing nothing but the rocky ground far under her feet. She rolled onto his deck as his ship shook through the violent turn. Roe peered back long enough to watch. There's the second typo of the day. I guess 2 is not so shameful if it's only people on stream seeing me. Once other folks read it, they'll think I had it right all along. Roe peered back long enough to watch her beloved ship break apart on the mountainside. Then she started working the controls to help Law navigate these impossible winds and passes. Steam wafted from several places it should not have been leaking. 2 of his ropes snapped. They continued to adjust as they hooked low around one side of the mountains. They swung out over the foothills in the kingdom's territory again. The winds grew kinder with each bit of distance they put between themselves and the gray mountains. Law scanned the clear skies and spotted the dark shapes of a dragon and a villain ship retreating side by side. This war was far from over, but the kingdom had been defended today. He surrendered his controls to Roe and leaned over the side with the spyglass, searching the forest below to the south for Baz's ship. Anything, she asked? He said, hold steady and go slow. Keep us over the trees. Those crazy stripes of his balloon should be easy enough to spot. If the dragon didn't scorch his ship black, then maybe. Law did not look away from the ground. He was burned, but not completely. Roe did not respond, but held steady. After long minutes, Law shouted, there! The ship and its deflated airbags had hung up in the canopy below. Baz had covered several miles in his controlled crash. About a quarter mile further south, a column of smoke spired into the air. Baz was still standing and waving. He looked hurt the last time Law saw him, but apparently he wasn't gone yet. Law lifted a hand, but before he could speak, Rose said, I see it. I'm descending now. There's room to land, and then we can get word to the rest of the fleet and the king as well. Law sighed. It does not feel like a victory, does it? Sometimes surviving has to be victory enough. I will not get over the loss of my ship soon, though. Your ship is leaking from every seam. We need to load him up quickly and get back to the others while we still can. As Law watched that thin column of smoke rise from the ground, he wondered if there would be more fires and smoke rising over the kingdom in the near future.